Right. Thank you, David, for that introduction. I want to start by paying tribute to all the excellent speakers we've had today and for being such hard acts to follow, really, and also to the organisers for putting together such a great event. And you can see the level of interest by the Twitter feed, which as I was sitting there, I could see it scrolling away and scrolling away. So I'm going to try and not look at it as I'm speaking to you now. Enrique raised some general points about the international and historical experience of comparative regional performance, which factors have proved to be important, and what that means in terms of an evidence-led orientation for policy. I want to echo 2 points in particular, complementary points that I agree with, and I think are especially germane in the present context of local economic development policy, namely that government should promote growth in all regions, and secondly, that localities should invest in their own growth by mobilizing local assets and resources to capitalize on their unique strengths, rather than depending on national transfers or subsidies, which almost by definition must mean some dilution of local focus if they're premised on delivering against national objectives. And I want to explore how in the current economic context, public policy and the local leadership through LEPs can respond to these concerns. I want to start by exploring the broader context for local growth over the coming years, and I'll argue that the challenges that the economic context and the policy context throw up really means a new focus on improving the local business environment for all businesses. Now, you'd expect me to say that, coming from the British Chambers of Commerce and given the broad membership of chambers, but also, I think in the future, accessing funds to invest in the local economy and addressing strategic economic priorities will come increasingly to depend on the ability of localities to grow their local business stock, whether we're talking about the retention of business rate revenues, whether we're talking about community infrastructure levy revenues from new commercial premises, or the successful use of tax increment financing, borrowing against future growth in business rates. Now, this change in emphasis will present some very difficult choices that local authorities haven't had to face for some time, and choices about what risks they're prepared to take on in the medium term in the pursuit of long-term growth. Now, here's my slide on the economic context for subnational economic development. And of course, presenting on the economic context for economic development deserves a presentation in itself, of course it does. But in the short time that I have here, I just want to focus on one aspect of it in particular, which I think is one of the most important in terms of setting the direction at a local or city regional level. Now, what the chart shows is the components of the UK economy and how they've grown over time. And between the end of the 1990s recession, shown by the bar there next to 1991, right up to the present, almost the present day, the final bar there for 2010, we can see that private consumption has really been the main driver of growth over that time. In that time, as a share of the economy, it grew by 4 percentage points. As the share for business investment stayed relatively stable, the share for public sector investment rose slightly, and net exports, so the surplus of exports over import revenues, which had in 1991 made a positive contribution to the economy, had by 2008 become a drag roughly equal to about 3% of GDP. Now, if you think about some of the pressures going forward on the economy, if you think about the paying down of the national debt, the pressures that there must be on consumer spending as consumers choose to pay down their debt, it's pretty clear that in the future, the UK economy's recovery is going to become increasingly dependent on business investment and exports. And I'm afraid that the recent history of the UK economy shows that this kind of change and this kind of change in the model of growth is not going to be easy to achieve. Business investment intentions are still quite fragile given some of the uncertainties there are in the world. But we shouldn't be overly pessimistic about this. According to the IMF, if we look over the next 2 or 3 years, the growth in the Indian economy alone will be about 36 billion. In the Brazilian economy, about $280 billion. And for the Chinese economy, almost unbelievably, the IMF believes that over the next 3 years, its economy will grow by about $1.6 trillion, roughly half or just over half the size of the UK economy in totality. To tap into just a small share of that would be hugely transformative for any city region, including Leeds. So this poses two questions. How can we ensure that economic development in the future responds to these pressures and taps into the most viable sources of economic growth, business investment and exports? And how do we mobilize resources at a local level to deliver against this? Well, to understand that, we've firstly got to think about what the changing policy context is. And just briefly outlining what the policy context is, because I think we've heard from a number of different speakers what the true characteristics of that are. I think the main thing to point out is that although this story is still playing out, we've got the localism bill currently in the Lords, we've got the local government resource review currently out for consultation too. It's pretty clear what the direction of travel is, and that is that increasingly local authorities will have to rely for their resources on growth in the local business stock, because so many of the tools for investing in the economy will depend on that. As I said earlier, retained business rates, tax increment financing, community infrastructure levies, all of those to some extent are dependent on growth in the business stock. So being that that is the case, I would argue that really the focus of ED should be in the future growing the local business stock and having an absolute focus on that. So in terms of what I hear going around the country and speaking to chambers and also the work that I do through the National Network for LEPs, I would say that what I hear pretty consistently is that the business priority for LEPs really should be about a laser-like focus on growing the business stock, about addressing the enterprise challenges of an area. And how might one do that? Well, it has to begin with an articulation of the long-term strategy for enterprise growth based on a realistic appraisal of the area's strengths and weaknesses. We need to identify what the existing barriers to business growth are, whether they're in terms of land use planning, whether they're in terms of infrastructure, in the broadest sense, transport and broadband and so on, and how the skills system delivers locally for businesses too, and whether they're delivering the right skills and in the right quantities. We should also think about how we can sell the area in terms of taking responsibility for bids for central government funding where that still exists, such as with the Regional Growth Fund, and what we can do to lever in private investment and influence local funding streams as well. But the key point to emphasize is that wherever I go in the country and I speak to businesses about LEPs, they all say pretty much the same thing, which is that LEPs should be absolutely focused on business growth, business growth, business growth. So the question is, what can LEPs do specifically to support this? And what can public policy do to help? Well, the first thing they can do, the least costly thing the central government can do to support LEPs, I would argue, is to avoid overloading them. The central government and other interests with a subnational remit must not come to see LEPs as a kind of delivery unit of choice for all sorts of things simply because of the geographical level at which they operate. This is likely to lead to some of the same mission creep we saw with RDAs and the sort of mission creep that Andrew Carter alluded to in his speech earlier on this morning. And I have to say as well, my experience through the National LEP network is that there is already evidence that this is happening in some areas. And I hear regularly of examples of LEP boards being approached, for example, to take part in sector-led initiatives, even when those sectors have never had any real role in the local economy and are not likely to in the future. So we need to think about, and central government certainly needs to think, about how it can communicate with LEPs in an intelligent way so that it doesn't seem to overload them. And there has to be an understanding that there is the potential for businesses to disengage with LEPs as well if they are overwhelmed by calls to align with this or that agendas that don't truly speak to the needs of their local areas. And of course, the other thing that we need to think about is what levers LEPs can have actually to influence and shape their local economies. And there's a whole range of areas, some of which have been alluded to today, where this could happen. So, for example, on skills, do LEPs have a role in bending skills investment in their areas to deliver against identified business needs? On investment, what roles can LEPs play in shaping the charging schedules, for example, for community infrastructure levies, and striking the right balance between raising funds for investing in local priorities, but also balancing that against affecting the decisions for businesses to relocate in an area. And on spatial planning, could LEPs play a formal role in shaping local spatial plans and have rights of appeal to the Secretary of State if they're not sufficiently pro-growth in outlook? On transport, could LEPs set the transport investment for their area and for a wider region in cooperation with neighbouring LEP areas? And on inward investment, we've already heard some things today about how LEPs are taking the initiative in that area too. So to summarise, I realise I've completely rattled through these slides, so I want to start by saying that in terms of what makes a successful city region, well, in a sense, it's the same now as it's always been. They need to capitalise on the local assets that they have and be enabled, empowered to invest in their local strengths. Business investment and exports has to be at the forefront of a lasting UK economic recovery, and the best thing that we can do at a local level to support that is by looking at the business environment for all businesses, rather than concentrating on a narrow proportion of them. And that's my speech over in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.